Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're to be with me to learn some things about accounts payable in Dynamics GP. Let me go over some overview stuff for you today. I'm going to look at these 10 topics. I'm going to move through this webinar at a moderately fast pace. I'm going to be hitting the high points of many of the features and not necessarily giving you every detail to do this yourself. However, there are downloadable notes, instructions for all 10 of these items. It's about 20 pages, and it has some details on how to do the things we're going to talk about today. So my goal is to present a buffet of options so that you can see what's available. Maybe one of these two topics are not for you, but I'm sure that some of them are going to be helpful for you. So thank you for coming. And lastly, I have a couple disclaimers. Some of these features may still need to be installed on your network. Some of these features may require that you have additional permissions. So if your job is strictly payables, you may need additional permissions to do some of the things we're going to talk about. But you do own all of these topics that we're going to discuss today except for the last one. Modifier is a third-party product that you have to buy separately from GP. I'm only going to spend about 2 minutes on it. That's not really my intention here to go over Modifier. I'm going to focus on the other issues. And lastly, I'm going to be using Dynamics GP 2016, but all these topics should be available if you're on GP 2013 or 2015. So let's get started with our first topic, expense deferral. So this is a great feature. It's part of a larger package called revenue and expense deferral, and there's all sorts of features available with this. We're just going to look at using this feature on the fly, and we're going to use this feature for posting invoices to a prepaid account. And you're going to go through the normal invoice entry screen and the normal distribution screen to allocate it to the accounts payable and to the prepaid. But then we're going to click on the expense deferral side, and we're going to create the future journal transactions that are going to relieve or credit the prepaid account and debit the expense account. All right, expense deferral. So there are some setup issues that need to happen in financial under setup. There's a deferral screen that needs to be set up, and I have a picture of this, a screenshot of this in my notes. And there's a deferral profile that needs to be set up, and on that profile, at the very least, we need to make sure that there's some users that are set up with permission to access the profile. So a couple setup options in financial that have to happen. Let's look at it in purchasing. I'm going to go into transaction entry. And what I'm going to simulate is my annual insurance premium. And I'm going to assume that I got my premium sometime in December of 16 for the following year, for the entire year 2017. I'm going to find my insurance vendor, drop the invoice number in here, and we'll put an insurance bill for 2017 in there. We go to our distributions, and by default for this vendor, it's going to want to allocate that to the prepaid insurance account. 1410 is the prepaid insurance, and credit accounts payable. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the additional section, and we're going to do a deferral. I want to defer this from 1/1/17 through 12/31/17. I'm going to do an equal amount per period, and I'm going to go find the expense account. Let's for the sake of this demo use interest expense. Obviously not the right account, but I'm not seeing my insurance account offhand. And it's going ahead and it's creating for January, February, March, all the way through December, which is the period I asked it to, equal distributions. These are going to be future transactions that it's going to post right with this invoice to relieve my prepaid account and expense my expense account. I hit OK. Yes, I want to save my changes. Yes, I'm happy with my distribution. And I'm going to post it. And I'm going to get a barrage of reports to print. I'd like to see this one. And as this one has our $240,000 debit to prepaid, credit to payables just like you would expect if we hadn't done the deferral. And the second posting journal is showing us the 12 monthly postings, $20,000 a month. We're going to credit the prepaid, debit the expense account for all 12 months. So it's a nice little utility, gets all that done. I know when I was an end user, we were always fighting at month end and quarter end statements to make sure that we allocated our prepaids accordingly. This will do it for you. This second topic that I have on here, customer refunds. We're not going to get into a lot of depth of it. There are notes still available in the handout, and I'm just going to spend a minute and talk about what customer refunds are. Essentially, if you take deposits from customers that you expect to refund, this is a great utility. Also, if you end up getting returns and having to refund customers for that purpose, this is just a great utility for that as well. Essentially, a customer refund creates the journal entries to relieve that credit in receivables management, and then it automatically creates the vendor ID and the payables batch for the refund check. So most of this starts in the receivables management. Actually, the vast majority of this happens in receivables management, and receivables management just pushes the refund check straight into a payables batch, and if your end of the job is payables, you just pick that batch up and pay it. It's a great utility. Vendor Modifier used to be part of the professional tools, so you did actually own this in the past, but it was a separate download, and it's a very powerful utility. We're going to see how to change vendor IDs with it, and it's in Utilities, and it's the last one. It's actually called Vendor Combiner Modifier. I'm going to talk about the combiner for a second. Combiner is actually going to merge two vendors together. It's non-reversible once you decide that you're merging two vendors together. The history for the one vendor that is merged into the second vendor is available only through the second vendor ID. You can never go back and see it through the first vendor ID again. There's no way to reverse that. It's very important that you back up anytime you use this utility to make sure you're doing what you want it to do. And we're not going to do a demonstration of Vendor Combiner, just know that's available. Let's talk about Vendor Modifier, where you could go from one ID to another ID, and you could load that those numeric IDs on the left side and the alpha IDs on the right side, and all at once it would modify them. For my example, I have some employee IDs, and I noticed, and this is a shout out to Justin Klein, our project manager, that I set up Justin, but unfortunately I spelled Justin's name wrong. And so I just want to fix this. And while I'm fixing it, I think I want to space it out. And E before I in Klein, I believe, is the correct way to do it. So I'm going to take the ID on the left, I'm going to change it to the ID on the right, I'm going to hit Process, and it's going to tell me I better back up first, and I'll give you that warning as well. You should back up before doing this. But this is my demo company, so I'm gonna live on the edge. Looks like that succeeded. And we'll just go look for Justin over here. Okay, so there's the new vendor ID. It's not going to change the name, the short name, the check name. You'll still have to go in and do that, but it does the hard part that you could not do otherwise. You'd have to live with the old spelling. So that's the vendor modifier. Our next topic that we're going to look at is document attachment. This is a newer feature, and it's really nice. It can be used on almost any master record or transaction in GP. What we're going to look at is during payables invoice entry, we're going to look at the ability to attach a scanned invoice, and it's going to be a permanent part of that invoice record in GP. There is some setup involved in this. It's documented in the notes. At a very minimum, we need to turn document attachment on. We need to make sure this checkbox is checked, otherwise you won't see document attachment as a feature. You can set a default location to look for scanned documents. You can do some other settings about email and workflow, but right now I'm just going to show you document attachment during payables invoice entry. We're going to go back to our transactions. We're going to go back to transaction entry. And I think I've got an invoice I can attach on my desktop, and it's a travel voucher. It's a conference that needs to be paid. And I guess we're fine with that date. Let's find a travel. There's a company, a travel company. We use our standard document number. And I think the voucher is $17,800. And the distributions look great. Travel, service, installation, accounts payable is credit. That looks great. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do this blue attachment. You would not see this blue paperclip until we turned on document attachment feature. Once you do that, any screen that allows attachments will have the blue paperclip and the word attach. I want to save the transactions, sure. You want me to throw it in a batch before I can save it. All right, so now I can do the attachment. You want to save the transaction? Yes. And if you have a Windows compliant scanner, there's a very specific type of scanner that GP works with. I believe I have it documented in the notes. You could scan straight from the glass of your scanner. Otherwise, you can use the attach. It'll go to the default directory, and it looks like I have an invoice here. And I can look at it, preview it, and sure enough, it's from the travel company. And it looks like it's for a conference for, look, it's for me, for my continuing education with first-class airfare to Hawaii, all-inclusive resort accommodations. And I guess I'll be going to the Improve Your Golf Swing VIP conference. That looks like it's going to be a nice event with gratuities and everything. So we can close that up. That now is a permanent part of this transaction record. I hit OK. I can post that or save it. But whenever I go back and look at that transaction, that invoice is attached to it. Modify columns in the Edit Check Batch screen. Just a very simple little tip trick for you. It allows you to go into that screen, add columns, delete columns, sort the information. Let's take a quick look at that. All right, so this is the Edit Check Batch screen. Find a batch. All right, so what I'm saying here is that we can click on this column button and we can change what we're looking at. So I could say I really don't want to see the vendor ID, I want to see the vendor name, and I don't really care about the payment priority. And it'll change those titles. I come over here and say I really don't care about the voucher number, I want to see the document number. I don't care about the terms. I want to see the transaction description. And so it changes what it shows. You may find that you need to move these widths around a little bit, make everything fit nicely. The other thing that you can do is you can click on the top of a column and it will sort that column for you, or sort the documents by that column. We could sort it by amount remaining if we want. We could sort it backwards by amount remaining, whatever works for you. So just a quick little tip about what you can do in this screen to make your life a little easier. I know some of the clients have numeric vendor names, and when they're using vendor ID, they have to be pretty good to figure out what the numbers mean. So you could just switch right now to vendor name and actually see who your vendors are. All right. This next feature, I know as an end user of Dynamics GP, I was with the company and they had not been on GP very long, but they had quite a volume of checks that were printed, invoices, and I was always trying to go back into the history, and so I'd select the vendor and I'd go back into the history, and it seems like I'd be trying to navigate through the transaction inquiry screen to find the document that I wanted. And I'd always inevitably, I'd go into the transaction inquiry screen, and I'd have to limit it by the year that I'm looking for to just narrow that down and make it easier to find. What I'm going to show you is how to do the same thing in the navigation pane to look up transaction history. So again, what I was saying, I would normally use transaction by vendor and come in here, and it would show me all sorts of stuff. And I know some of you have years and years and years of stuff. And so what you have to do if you just want to look at last year, you have to go and you have to change this to document date. You have to be able to type the date in, and then you hit redisplay. All right, and that just shows me my more recent stuff. And that works great. But what I'm going to show you is to use the navigation pane over here on the left, to use Payables Transactions. And it's going to populate the screen with Payables Transactions. The default setting for this is looking not looking at history. So number one, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to include history to this. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to restrict my history by a customized date. So I'm going to say give me history just for the last 365 days, and it's going to restrict by that. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say I really don't care about my payments. Maybe I'll make a separate setting for payments, but I just want to look at invoices. So I'm going to add a filter, and my filter is going to be where document type is equal to invoice. And now if I click on the arrow, it'll show me just my invoices. And lastly, I'm going to go up to this payable transaction drop-down screen, and I'm going to save this. And you see I've already saved one called invoices. I'm going to call this invoice demo. And now you can see next time I come in here and I go to invoice demo, it's going to have saved my criteria. I'm looking at history for the last 365 days. I'm only looking at invoices. Now that we have a saved parameters, we can drop down here and we have more options. And I'm going to go to the Customize option. And I'm going to go to Columns. And I'm going to say that I'd rather see the vendor ID than the vendor name. And, you know, I could put a due date out there if I want. There, so now I have my vendor ID out there, and I could type in here a vendor ID, CRUGEREN0001, and hit enter, and it's going to limit it to just that vendor. Next time we come in here, that changed the vendor ID, the due date information will still be there. So you could create one of these for invoices, one of these for credit memos, one of these quick links for payments. You might find this is a feature that's easier to use and gets you the information quicker than that transaction inquiry screen. One last thing we can do is, actually two things we can do. One, we can click on any invoice we want. We don't really have to put the checkbox there. We can just double click on it and it's going to drill back just the same way you could in transaction inquiry. See the distributions if you want. Same kind of information you get from transaction inquiry. And last thing that we can do is, once we've filtered and we have a list that we really like, we could click on all of them, or we could unclick some of them, whatever we want. But finally, we can hit the Go To button and we can send this list to Excel. I like this feature, and I think it's got some great uses, being able to save different parameters like that. All right, I know if your job is payables, you are really glad that your 1099s are out, that your 1096s are printed, and you probably don't want to talk about them right now. I apologize for my insensitivity to your pain. I am going to talk about them right now. I do know I got a number of phone calls saying, hey, our 1096 form isn't lining up, or hey, our 1099 form isn't lining up. I know I've sat through report writer training, and I thought that no human being should ever do what they were asking me to do in report writer training. I thought that was a total geek kind of thing. I didn't know anything about these tables or all these fields that were out there, and it was the last thing I wanted to do. I want to show you a real easy way to modify, just to move the fields around on your forms. And this would work with any report you have, whether it's a 1096 or a trial balance or a vendor listing. I'm going to show you an easy way to do it. We're going to go into the routines where that print 1099 is. And I'm going to print the 1096 form to the screen. And just so you know, This is set to print the 1099 miscellaneous box on the 1096 form. There's really three options, a miscellaneous, an interest, and a dividend. And this is what that form looks like on my screen. Any report that you send to screen, you can click this Modify button, and you may need additional permissions to do this. You can click this Modify button, and you don't even have to know how to get into Report Writer. It's going to open Report Writer up with that form on it. And this is the 1096 form. These little boxes that I'm highlighting are where it's going to put a checkbox, one if it's an interest, one if it's a dividend, one if it's a miscellaneous. And all you're going to do to move that little checkbox is highlight it and then use your arrow keys. I'm using my up arrow key, I'm using my left arrow key, and you're just going to reposition it so that it sits in the right place when they change the form. If your name, the company name, doesn't sit in the right place, you can do the same with that field. Just highlight it, use your arrow keys to move them up and down. Once you think you've got it, you close this with the red X at top, you save it, you close the report definition with the red X at top, you save it, and then from the menu over here, you can navigate back to Microsoft Dynamics GP. That's the easy way to move fields around in an existing report without needing to learn a programming language or sacrifice your humanity in the process. Okay, so you need to know two things. You need to know something about how Dynamics GP thinks. Dynamics GP always has an original of every report. You can never change that original. When you modify an original, what's happening is a copy of it's being made. And the first time you modify any form, you have to go into Dynamics and tell it that you don't want to use the original anymore. You want to use the modified version. And I have this documented, but in administration, there's a utility under Setup called Alternate Modified Forms and Reports. And this is by user ID. Most of you are set up with the default user ID, but many of you have unique user IDs, and you need to make sure that you're looking at the right one. We're looking at reports, and the screen will populate, and we're looking at the 1096 form. And there's two versions. There's an original version and there's a modified version. If this was the first time I was in the form, it would show that I normally use the original version, and you'd have to go and check the modified version and able to see the changes you made. Click Modified, click Save, and now when you run that report, you'll see the modified version of it. In this mixed batch one per check, I actually have a client that asked for this, and essentially this is what we in the business call a workaround, which is geek speak for the software doesn't do it, but we're going to make the software do it. And essentially, there are certain vendors that if you write them a single check over multiple accounts, they will invariably credit the wrong account for you. And so generally the way people work around that in Dynamics GP is they set up 4 Blue Crosses or 4 Consumers Energies or however many of that vendor they need, so that they can send each vendor pay each vendor for a specific invoice. Well, GP actually has a feature that lets you create one check per invoice, and we're going to look at that. We're going to look at an easy way to designate certain vendors as one check per invoice vendors and create a mixed batch where some vendors are getting paid one check for every invoice, and other vendors are getting paid one check per vendor. I'm going to go back into purchasing, and what I'm going to do is in the setup feature of payables, I'm going to go to the options, and I'm going to use this user-defined field, and I'm going to change the name of it. I'm going to call it, I can call that user-defined, save it back up. What I want to do for this, I want to go into the vendor cards, and in vendor cards under options, we have this payment priority field. And most of you don't use it, but it's a feature that lets us discriminate which vendors get paid, and it's something we can use for this workaround. So I'm going to use the number 1 to signal that I want this vendor to get one check per invoice. Save it, find another vendor, and do the same to that vendor, save it. And so for every vendor that I want to get individual checks per invoice, I'm going to call them the payment priority 1. Then when we're in transactions and we're in select checks, down here we have this option called 1 check per. The default is vendor. If you don't do anything, you're going to get 1 check per vendor. What I want to do is I want to change that to 1 check per invoice. And I want to build a batch for my vendors that are payment priority 1. You could add additional restrictions if you normally do a due date restriction. We can add a due date restriction if you want. But the important thing is I am looking at just vendors with payment priority 1, and I've changed the 1 check per to invoice. I'm going to create a batch. We'll assign a checkbook ID to it, save it, select it, and now I'm going to build my batch. And this will take us a few seconds. Okay, so we have $246,000 of invoices we're going to pay. And now I'm going to pay the rest of my vendors. And I could do a restriction if that's how you normally do it, you know, with the cutoff date, insert it, and I'm going to add to batch. Since this is now set to 1 check per vendor, everybody I'm adding to the batch is going to be 1 check per vendor now. The first time I ran it was 1 check per invoice. I'm adding 1 check per vendors. And we should have a little more than 246 when this is over. Oh, there it is. There it is. So now I have 1,000,005. And I can print my checks. Print to screen. We'll just lower that for the moment. We'll look at our check output. The travel company is one of the vendors that I wanted to see 1 check per vendor. So it's writing this check for $180. It's writing a check for $596. It's writing a check for $605. Another check, another check, another check. And associated insurance, even though there's multiple items on this, it's really just one invoice it's paying. There's a second invoice for associated insurance, third, fourth, and now it's onto my vendors that were 1 check per vendor. So you can see that for Advanced Office, it's paying all the invoices in a single check. So that's a nice little feature if you're trying to straighten out your utility bills or your vendors that can never quite figure out what account you want to pay. All right, topic 9. I'm not going to spend much on 10, so we're almost done here. Use Smart List reminders to alert you when you're missing invoices. Essentially, anytime you have a monthly invoice, I know when I'm running financial statements, I'm always wondering, did I get all the bills in the month? And I have to kind of do a mental assessment. Did I get my Blue Cross? Did I get my Consumer's Energy? Did I get all my employee expense reports and so forth? What we can do here is we can, again, go into our vendor cards and tag them, those vendors that I get a monthly invoice from. And I'm going to do this originally with the payable setup. I'm going to go into the options, and here's where I'm going to change my user defined, and I'm going to call it vendor type. You could call it anything you want. That's not what's important about this, but for this demonstration, I'm going to use vendor type. I'm going to hit OK, and now when I go into my cards, I'm going to look up my employee reimbursements. I'm going to go to the options, and that user-defined 1 field is now called vendor type, and I just have my employees set up with expense report in that field. And that's simply so that when I do a smart list, it just pulls those vendors. I look at Phil, options, expense report. Justin, options, expense report. Okay, you get the idea. I'm now going to go into my smart list. I'm going to go to my vendors, and I'm going to restrict by vendor type. And again, if you changed your user defined to some other word than vendor type, you'd have to look up that title. I'm going to go with vendor type equals expense report. I'll go OK. And it's going to show me a list of my 5 or 6 or 7 employees that I'm expecting to get an expense report from. Next thing I want to do is I want to go to my columns and get rid of columns I just don't care about. and add one column I do care about, and it's called the last purchase date. And click OK. And it's going to show me the last time I received an invoice from these vendors, or from in this case, from my employees, my employee expense reports. Lastly, we're going to go back into the search criteria and add one more. And I want my last purchase date. I want to know if it's less than the current month. These are the people that have not submitted a February expense report to me. You could do this again for utilities, for anybody where you're expecting to get a monthly invoice. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to add it, but I'm going to add it with a favorite, a reminder. I'm going to make it a favorite with a reminder, and the reminder is that anytime the record is greater than 0, anytime there are people that haven't given me an invoice in the current month, I want to see that reminder. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to shut this, and now on my home page, I see this monthly invoice reminder, and in brackets it means that there are 3 records or 3 people that have not submitted their expense report to me. I can click on it, I can see who it is, and now I know who to email and follow up on. Alright, and as I promised, I'm just going to spend a minute or two in Macorma. This is third-party software. You do not own this with GP unless you bought it separately. And it's just got a lot of great features that enhance the standard GP check printing process. All right, just real quickly, one of the great things about this product, if you have multiple companies, is that you can print on blank check stock. It will fill out the company name, it'll fill out all the check information, all the voucher information, and it'll print the MICR at the bottom. So you're not trying to keep track of 5 or 6 or 10 different check stocks. It's a great feature. Another great feature, a lot of people ask me, can you put the GL account distribution from the invoices on the check stub? Macorma has a check stub that does that. Another great feature is that it creates PDF copies, actual copies of your checks and remittances. In GP, you can get a remittance copy, but not an actual check copy. So Macorma does that, and it allows some great abilities to create file folders on your network, either sorted by checkbook ID or vendor ID or date, a lot of different ways that it automatically will sort these checks so that it makes it easy to retrieve. And finally, I'm going to jump back. We're going to look at Macorma. We're going to switch to Fabricam. I'm going to go back into Administration Setup, Company, Macorma, Security. What Macorma allows you to do is set Security ID by user. So I have 2 users set up here. I have the SA user, and the SA user has access to the First American Bank. They have a maximum authorized amount of $100,000. The second user ID, Schwartz, he has a $100 limit, and he can only write it on the petty cash account. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea how you can structure different users with different rights. In addition, even though the SA has a $100,000 max authorization, there is a threshold, and that threshold you can set at whatever. I set it at $50,000, and where the threshold comes in is we can, from this drop-down menu, choose both passwords and how signatures print based on whether you're under the threshold or over the threshold. So even though I have a max 100,000, once I get over 50,000, once I get over the payable threshold, this says print. It says it requires 1 password over threshold, none if under, 1 signature when under threshold, none if over. So it's some extra levels of security, and those are configurable, lots of options, and they're user by user configurable. So that concludes the Payables webinar. I hope you learned a couple things that will make your life easier going forward. Thank you for your time today.